The most likely explanation is that multiple authors were working on different parts of the books and did not consult with each other what they were putting in each of their parts. And that is precisely what is described in the documentary hypothesis, which I previously talked about in my first video in this series. According to this hypothesis, Genesis is composed of mostly the J or Jahwist source, with a little of the E or Elohist source, and roughly about a fifth of the book is made up of the P or priestly source. The Jahwist source is generally regarded as the earliest source and is estimated to have been written between the 9th and 10th centuries BC. The Jahwist source tends to refer to God as Yahweh, even in the book of Genesis, and tends to portray God as very human-like. The Jahwist is also generally thought to have emerged out of Judah, whereas the Elohist is thought to have arisen out of the northern tribes of the king of Israel. The Elohist source is regarded as emerging at a slightly later time than the Jahwist, around the 8th and 9th centuries BC, and tends to refer to God as Elohim, and tends to focus on supernatural phenomena like angels. The priestly source is almost universally regarded as the latest source in the group. The priestly source made their additions just prior to and during the Babylonian exile period. The priestly source also tends to call God Elohim, at least in Genesis, and tends to focus on details like ages, family lineages, and the origins of various customs like circumcision. The priestly source also tends to portray God as very much superhuman, supernatural, and the creator of the earth. I also did mention in a previous video I was going to explain the origins of the Israelites. So I would first like to start with Amorites. This group is brought up repeatedly in the Bible as a distinct group from the Israelites, which, like the author's treatment of the Canaanites, I believe to be an error. Some of the very first mentions of the Amorites to be found were in texts dating back to the time of the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. In these Sumerian texts beginning around 2400 BC, the Amorites, also known as the Amaru or Martu, were described as living in lands west of the Euphrates, such as Canaan and modern-day Syria. The Amorites were also described as a nomadic people. Between 2000 and 1595 BC, roughly, is referred to as the Amorite period in Mesopotamia, where Amorites took positions of authority. Prior to 2000 BC, there was said to have been a great Amorite migration, where Amorites migrated eastward towards Sumer. The native Sumerian kings endeavored to keep the Amorites out of Sumer, even going so far as to build a wall to stop the Amorites from encroaching on their land. It's likely a lot of Amorite tribes stayed behind and tried to eke out a living in Canaan. It would make sense that if there were a real Abraham, that he and his family originated near Haran and then traveled down through Canaan, rather than originating first in Ur as is described in the Bible. According to Assyrian documents, there were place names in modern-day Syria that sounded similar to the names of Abraham's family, including the names Serug and Nahor. In Abraham's story, the name Damascus is also mentioned in Genesis chapter 15, verse 2. Even in the Bible, the words Amorite and Canaanite seem to be used interchangeably. One of the first clear references historically to Canaan as a distinct entity dates back to the 18th century BC, and a possible earlier reference from Ebla dates back to 2350 BC. The Canaanites, as mentioned previously in the first part of my Noah's Flood video, were divided into distinct agriculturalist, farmer, and pastoralist nomadic groups. These nomads were referred to in Egyptian texts as the Shozu, who lived mainly in the frontier regions of Canaan and the Transjordan. Another group described in Egyptian texts are outcasts from settled society, also called the Aparu. This group was described as brigands and outlaws, and sometimes as soldiers for hire. It was apparently a very serious insult for one petty king to refer to another by saying he joined the Aparu. Around 1200 BC, some interesting things happened. The Hittite Empire, which was previously rather strong, disintegrated, and the Egyptians had to fight a naval battle against a group of sea people, including the Philistines, who later settled along the coast of Canaan. Egyptian influence over Canaan weakened, and the city-state system in Canaan, previously upheld by the Egyptians, collapsed. This meant the agriculturalists were unable to reliably produce enough grain to allow the nomadic pastoralists to continue their way of life. So those pastoralists had to settle down and grow their own food. Shortly after the collapse of the Canaanite city-states, a wave of settlements emerged in the southern highlands of Canaan, which continued to be occupied until the Babylonian exile. Further, evidence of pig bones that had been found at other sites in and around Canaan, like along the coast of Canaan in the Philistine territories, and in the Ammonite and Moabite territories as well. However, no pig bones were to be found in the Canaanite southern highland territories during the Iron Age, which started roughly around 1150 BC. The evidence points strongly to the Israelites emerging from Canaanite nomads who were forced to settle down, and also possibly from outcasts of the fallen city-states in the lowlands of Canaan, as well as miners who had escaped from mining operations which were formerly run by Egyptians, which I will go into more detail about in a video later on down the line, like when I start on Exodus. So there we have it, the origin of the Israelites. How does this relate to Abraham? The general background of the story of Abraham is, I believe, a fairly accurate one. The general lifestyle described is very much like what Bedouin nomads today experience. Today, as in the past, they are heavily reliant on more subtle societies that produce grain. Abraham's location in most of his journey, with the exception of his starting out from the city-state of Ur, is fairly accurate for an Amorite of the day. The details of the story aren't so accurate, like the mention of Chaldeans or Chaldees, the migration out of Ur towards Canaan, and the Philistines clearly don't fit well with the story of a man who is supposed to have lived around 2100 to 2000 BC, and points to a later authorship, later even than Moses. Further, the contradiction of Exodus chapter 6 verse 3 versus all the other parts of Genesis written by the J or Jahwist source, which mention Yahweh by name, lends credence to the theory that there were multiple authors trying to piece together a coherent narrative, but who failed occasionally to catch mistakes. In the next video, I shall continue with the story of Isaac. As Isaac's story is very short, the next video will undoubtedly also be very short. Cheers, and have a nice day.